and welcome back to our Stewardship of Creation series. The last couple of months, we have talked about why people of faith should be concerned about the environment and should engage in stewardship of the environment. And we've talked about how to create a green team and how to nurture the green team so that it thrives while engaging in actions that most of us do as volunteer work on top of all of the other commitments that we have in our lives. Today, I'd like to spend some time talking about ideas of various areas of activity that green teams can get involved with, because greening a congregation actually doesn't necessarily just mean putting up solar panels. So we'll talk about some of the many options for practicing stewardship and focus particularly on activities that can be done within our houses of worship, but also how some of those projects might connect to our home lives so that they can ripple out into the wider communities and start to create more of a social norm in our communities so that people are practicing sustainability in their home lives as well as in their houses of worship. One of the nice ways to think about this is beautifully depicted in some resources that have been put together by Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. A few years ago, I worked with people at Michigan IPL to develop a Stewards of Hope program. And we talked about how the various areas of activity that are possible for a congregation could be sorted into a bunch of different categories. So we can talk about buildings and energy, which is of course where the solar panels would come in, but also thinking about how to transform people's values and behavior. There are a lot of things that can be accomplished just through behavior change, and that has the advantage of being basically free. The purchasing and recycling practices that we engage in our houses of worship, the transportation systems we use to get to our houses of worship, the food that we serve in our communities, the way we care for the land and the way we use water in our communities. All of these are things that we do in the day-to-day workings of our caring for our buildings, caring for our grounds, administering our offices, running our religious education programs and our worship services. And all of them offer opportunities to make our practices more sustainable. And then, of course, there's advocacy, which I'll come to toward the end of today's discussion, because that one can be a little more controversial for people within faith communities. But let's start with a story about a remarkable congregation in Evanston, Illinois. Some years ago, the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation realized that their building no longer served their needs. The community had outgrown the space. So they did what any congregation does. They organized a task force, which had the job of figuring out what they should do next. Would it be best to sell the building and move somewhere else? Or should they try to renovate the old building? Or would it ideally be best to tear down the old building, start from scratch, and build something new in the same location? The task force decided they liked that third option best. They had been in this location for many, many years. They were attached to it and it had great advantages. There was a bus stop right on their corner and they were across the street from a senior center, which meant they had access to exercise facilities and parking on the weekends and all sorts of benefits that the community enjoyed. Now, fortuitously, the year before this decision was made, a new group had formed at this congregation that called itself an environmental task force. And they were looking specifically at how Judaism connected to care for creation. And when the decision was made to build a new building, some of the members of this task force had just returned from a presentation on green construction. And they thought, hey, we should do this here. So they took their idea to the board. The board, of course, basically said, we're not sure about this. It's all very new and we don't know anything about it. They were also worried about the cost. But the rabbi got very excited. Rabbi Rosen thought this would be a great way to actually put their social justice and faith values into practice. So he started coming to every board meeting and beginning the board meeting with a prayer that talked about care for creation. And he encouraged the board and the environmental task force to explore what it would actually take to build a green building. Now, of course, most of the members of this task force didn't actually know that themselves. So they took advantage of their location, which is very near to Chicago, and they went on field trips and visited other buildings that were constructed according to green building standards. So they were able to find out what would it actually look like if they followed those standards and engaged in some new and innovative building practices, practices that would reduce the amount of waste generated during construction, practices that would ensure that the new building was built to very high standards of energy efficiency, or was using resources in a renewable way instead of in a wasteful way. And they would come back and present their ideas and present information about what they'd found in public meetings with the congregation. And after a while, the congregation got really excited about this idea, because it meant that they were going to build a building that wasn't just a building, it was actually an expression of their spiritual values. So they actually were able to raise more money in their construction fundraising project than they ever thought they would have been able to do. And the result was the first platinum LEED certified synagogue in the United States. LEED stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And there are very strict rules about conservation of resources, reducing waste, using renewable rather than non-renewable resources in the project, building to high energy efficiency standards so that the building won't use many resources after it's constructed. So here you see the beautiful building that they constructed, and the exterior wood siding is wood that has actually been repurposed from old barns here in the Midwest. You also can see the walls out front, which actually are constructed by using a mesh and filling it with old concrete rubble, much of which came from the previous building that had to be disassembled in order to make way for this one. You can also see the large windows that bring in daylight so that they don't have to use as much electricity to heat the structure. And if you look very closely at the bottom left of the building, you'll notice that some of the windows are actually quite low to the ground. Those are windows in the classrooms for the small elementary school children, where the windows have been placed at child height instead of adult height, a charming touch that expresses how this building is important to all members of the community. Now, one of the things that was so striking when I traveled to this synagogue and went on a tour of it is that they talked about how in the process of building it, they had to take their time because people weren't familiar with what they were trying to do. So every time the building task force came up with an idea, they evaluated their options and said, well, let's use energy efficient appliances, but not try to do solar panels, because that will be a better use of our energy. And the reason for that is because the way we use our building is we have very high energy use on the weekends, but not that high energy use on weekdays. Solar would be good for a steady low-level use, but it wouldn't meet our needs on the weekends. We can do better with high efficiency appliances. And they would make a presentation about this to the community so people would understand why they wanted to do things in a particular way. And that slow iterative process of bringing their research to the community and explaining what they wanted to do and why, and bringing in imagery and showing people what it would look like to do things in a new way, that meant that everybody was on board with this project as it moved forward. One of the end results is that members of this community actually trained to be docents and lead tours of the building so that they can show other people what these features would look like, just as it was important for them to know what they looked like so that they could make the decision to use them. And in that way, the building has actually become a form of ministry, a way that they actually share their values so that others can do something similar. So one of the things that you see here is that Green building isn't just about the hardware, and it isn't just about the infrastructure, it's also about the process. And the end result can be absolutely beautiful. Here you see these in the upper picture, the worship space at the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation. It's actually on the top floor, which is very non-traditional for a Jewish worship space. Traditionally, a synagogue has its worship space on the first floor. But by placing it on the top floor, they were able to have windows that looked out at tree level. And this was a way to create a connection with God's creation, to have green space brought into the worship experience, even though they're in a very urban environment. If those windows had been on the ground floor, they would have been looking out at a driveway. You also see both on the side walls of the upstairs worship space and in the ceiling and walls of a chapel that's on the first floor, this beautiful wood, which is set up in a wavy pattern that's meant to evoke images of the tents that the Israelites lived in when they were traveling across the desert on their way to the Holy Land in ancient times. The wood that is used in this construction is all recycled wood. No new trees were cut down in order to create this building. The floors are actually concrete that has fly ash embedded in it. This is a way to use a waste product that contributes to pollution and also helps to sequester carbon that would otherwise get into the atmosphere. One of the nice touches is that the Ner Tamid, the eternal flame that burns 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, year round, and hangs over the bima, the cabinet that holds the Torah scrolls in the synagogue. This eternal flame is actually solar powered. So the eternal flame within the synagogue is powered by the eternal flame that makes life possible on our planet. You'll also notice the canopy that makes it possible to speak while using minimal amplification. So if there's a smaller group attending services, it isn't actually necessary to use as much electricity. And the same, of course, happens because of the windows. One of the other wonderful lessons that one learns from the story of the Jewish Reconstructionist congregation is that it is possible to engage all members of the community so that parents come to have buy-in in this process because their children are involved. When they started to do the construction project, they realized that the foundation of this congregation was going to need concrete pillars in order to make it stable enough. The soil here in this part of Illinois is very sandy. And so in order to build this 2-story building, they had to sink concrete pillars into the earth. And the construction project called for 18 pillars. Now, 18 is a very important number in Judaism. It's associated with the word chaim, which means life. And so the people thought that that was highly symbolic, that there would be 18 pillars on which their new synagogue was going to stand. And then the rabbi and one of the board members got the idea to go and talk to children in the 3rd and 5th grade classrooms and ask them about what they thought were the 18 pillars of community life in their synagogue. And the children created a list that included ideas like joy and song and respect and tikkun olam, the healing of the world. And each of these terms was written down on a piece of paper so that the construction workers could then place one of these symbolic pillars in each of the physical pillars that would support the synagogue that was to be built. And the construction workers got so excited about this project, every one of them wanted a chance to participate in that activity. Another way that this congregation has taken the ideas that are embodied in their building and brought them into the daily practices of their community is to create guidelines for a green simcha. So when people are celebrating a special event, like a wedding or a bar bat mitzvah, there are these guidelines that they can look at that tell them how to conserve resources while holding that event. So they're encouraged not to use styrofoam, but instead to use washable dishes. And the kitchen upstairs has dishes that people can rent or borrow and then wash upstairs. There's even a bunch of tablecloths that have been purchased for the use in the community. And a group of the women from the congregation have all made the commitment that they will take those tablecloths home and wash them so that they can be reused with regularity. So in these sorts of activities, we see people starting with a building, but then going beyond it to say, okay, if the building is an expression of our values, how then will we make those values part of our life on a day-to-day basis? One of the things that becomes evident when you start to examine what can be done with our buildings is that they offer a tremendous opportunity for changing the amount of pollution that we put in our atmosphere, the pollution through greenhouse gases that contributes to climate change. Because our buildings, as you can see in this chart that's put out by the US government, our buildings use a tremendous amount of electricity, and electricity is one of the ways that we pollute the atmosphere because so much of it is generated through coal or through natural gas. So our buildings offer a great opportunity. About 40% of the energy used in this country is in buildings, and of the electricity we use, over 70% of it gets used in buildings, mostly for heating, cooling, and lighting. And the biggest reduction in energy doesn't come from solar panels that generate renewers. The biggest reduction of energy comes from not using any energy at all, because even the construction of solar panels does engender pollution. So the more energy we can save, the better. Now, that doesn't mean that we all have to build the platinum green levels. There are a lot of ways that we can improve our buildings. And some of them are free. If you think about the three main areas that affect energy use in a building, there's the building envelope, how much heat or cold escapes through the walls and the windows and the doors and the roof. Then there are the systems, the appliances, the lights, what's within the building. And then finally, there are the behaviors. How do the people who use the building affect the use of energy in that building? Changing the building envelope, that can be expensive, but there are a lot of opportunities for actually doing things that don't cost that much and have a big return on investment. Buying new appliances is also expensive and is one of the bigger costs that we engender when it comes time to replace a furnace or a boiler system. But one of the things that we can do is to actually build our green values into the normal replacement system. So maybe you don't replace that furnace until it wears out, but when it does wear out, then you want to have a policy in place that says, okay, we're going to replace it with the most efficient option because stewardship of creation is important to us. The same thing with the building envelope. Maybe you have a roof replacement coming up in the next 10 years. When it comes time to do that roof replacement, that's a great opportunity to think about adding more insulation. So maybe it isn't something you do now because it wouldn't be easy to do while that roof is on, but while the roof is off, you can do it in a very cost-effective way. Human behavior is free to change, but it does take time and effort. So I'll give you some examples of things people have done and how effective they've been. Basic process of energy reduction. Start with an energy assessment. One of the things that we have that helps with this in Michigan is that our energy utilities, Consumers Energy and DTE Energy, actually will do energy assessments for free as part of the state's mandate to reduce the use of fossil fuels. So you can make an appointment and actually have somebody come out to your house of worship and do a baseline energy efficiency audit. It won't be the most sophisticated audit, but it's a good place to start. And then you want to track your utility bills. You want to set a baseline so that you can show people how things are getting better as you work on them and make improvements. There's a portfolio manager program the EPA has set up that makes it relatively easy to do this. And the program actually has been improved based on the experiences of people right here in Michigan. because Julie Lyons-Bricker, a former director of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light, actually helped to improve the program after using it to monitor the energy efficiency in 48 different houses of worship in Detroit. And there are a lot of energy efficiency upgrades that are actually really affordable and pay for themselves very quickly. I'll talk about a few of those in a moment, but I should mention one of the most effective is the LED exit sign. If you think about it, all of our houses of worship are mandated to actually have lit signs that tell people how to get out of the building should there be an emergency. And those signs have to be on 24/7. They're hardwired into the electrical system. If you replace an incandescent bulb in one of those and replace those signs with one that has LED bulbs instead, it will pay for itself within a couple of months and then save money from then on. We've already talked about the importance of celebrating accomplishments as a way to make the green team recognize what they've accomplished, feel good about what they've done, and help them keep going. But it's also a way to make sure that the congregation knows that the work that they authorized, the work that they wanted to happen, did occur, and that good things are going on because of their desire to allow the green team to engage in these activities. And then, of course, the money that gets saved, that money can actually be used for further projects. So here's an example of how this plays out in individual congregations. St. John's Episcopal Church, they replaced 32 of those exit signs that are on 24/7. Within 5 months, they'd pay for themselves, and they expect that every year they'll save about $650. They also went through a process over 5 years to replace all of the tube fluorescent lights with LED lights. Those light bulbs are a little bit more expensive, so it made sense to spread out that project over time. These are the lights that are in classrooms, hallways, offices, and they expect that by the time they're done, they'll be saving between 7 and 9% every year on their electricity bill. One of the things that's so surprising is how often you discover you haven't been bothering to recycle things, especially paper. It's often just a matter of starting a program. Here at St. John's, they have a bunch of different programs that are using space within the church buildings: a caterer, a resale shop, a food pantry, a daycare, and their own offices. By requiring that all of these programs engage in recycling, they reduced their waste by 75%. That means they don't have to have their trash bins, as many trash bins, and means they get a lower rate from the waste company. And of course, they're also sending less waste into a landfill, which is actually a social justice issue, because when we fill up our landfills, we have to build new ones, and usually those get built near low-income communities. Many churches, like St. John's, now offer fair trade coffee and chocolate for sale, and also use them in their own facilities. I don't think churches and synagogues and temples can run without coffee. It seems to be a necessity. One of the other things they've done at St. John's is to make sure that they offer energy efficiency education programs so that the activities they're undertaking at the church are visible to the members of the congregation and also become an inspiration for people to take those ideas home and think about how to implement them in their personal lives. And that means that the activities undertaken in the church ripple outward into the community, creating a sustainability ethic that is part of the wider community and is not just something that's done within the church itself. Faith Evangelical Lutheran actually undertook some larger changes to their structure. What they did was to really improve their heating system and their insulation. So by upgrading their appliances and adding zoned heating and cooling so they weren't wasting energy on parts of the building that weren't being used during the day, they were able to dramatically reduce their energy loss. And that was combined with the addition of insulation, so the energy they were using was staying in the building instead of going out into the air around the building. And the end result is that they actually saw an energy reduction of 68%. That's a lot of money to spend on ministries or other activities instead of giving it away to the utility company. They also instituted a policy so that all future appliances will have to be Energy Star rated appliances. The EPA has a system that makes it easy to identify which appliances are more energy efficient. You just look for the blue star and you know that those appliances use much less energy than some of the older ones do. So looking at some of these stories, we see it's not always necessary to do a dramatic project like replacing an entire building. There's a lot that can be done with our old buildings to make them more energy efficient. To make these things happen, it's important to involve the congregation. If it's a project that requires money, you're going to need their buy-in. And that's best done through community meetings and educational events so that they're on board with the project. A side benefit of taking the time to educate the community members like this is that they are then more likely to take those ideas home and implement them in their own houses. It's also important to share information about the accomplishments because the congregation said, yes, we should do this. And it's important they know what was accomplished once they gave permission and put up some funds to make it happen. And if they see the accomplishments and they're pleased with them, then they're more likely to provide more funds for ongoing activities. There are many resources out there that can help with energy efficiency work in houses of worship. Utilities have programs for things like home energy audits, and they also have rebates for new appliances, for insulation, even for installing electric vehicle charging systems. So it's worth checking those out and also looking for tax credit programs from states and from the federal government. One of the easiest ways to build these into our houses of worship is to have policies that say when it's time to upgrade or replace an appliance like a stove or a furnace, when it's time to repair our building, to replace windows or doors or roofs. Those are opportunities to actually think about how stewardship for creation can be part of what we do here in this building. Maybe there'll be a small additional cost or even a not so small additional cost, but these are changes that pay for themselves within a few years. We also see this great idea to create a revolving fund where you dedicate some of the money that's saved by the energy efficiency efforts and put it into a fund that then can be used for additional projects going forward. So if you put in LED exit signs and you know you're going to save $600 a year, put that $600 a year into a fund and use it to pay for the insulation that you want to put in next. And then take some of the money that you've saved from the higher efficiency building that doesn't require as much energy to heat and cool and put it into a fund for the next project. It starts to pay for itself pretty quickly. Stewardship behavior. There are so many things that we can do within our buildings which essentially don't change the costs. Think of what goes on in an office. How many newsletters do you print out? How many annual reports do you print out? How many bulletins do you print out for a service in a normal non-COVID year when we actually get to gather in our congregations? How much of that could be done electronically? Many congregations have decided that, particularly with the annual report, they can send that out as an electronic PDF or just post it on the congregational website and people can download it if they want it. And anyone who wants a paper copy could then request one and it will be printed out and sent to them. But why print it out unless somebody says they really need that paper copy? It's one of the easiest ways we can save money and energy because you're not doing all that printing with the copy machine. It's also rather surprising how many of us don't actually use power strips to turn off the computers and the copy machine at night when we leave the office. It's a pretty simple thing to do, and the energy savings adds up. Many congregations have also found that it's useful to actually pay attention to the way they use lights in the building. Maybe they're lighting areas that are barely used, and they could add motion sensors or just turn the lights off in those areas. One congregation found that they could shave the peaks and reduce energy by thinking about how they used their lights. And I'll come back to that in a moment too. Many congregations have switched to washable dishes and coffee cups. Some of them will actually put in an industrial dishwasher, but others actually do the washing by hand, and it becomes a form of fellowship as the people in the kitchen share time washing dishes together. I've been to churches where they've purchased all identical dishes that they can run through a dishwasher, and I've been to others where everyone brings a coffee cup and hangs it on the wall, and it becomes a delightful collage of diverse shapes and colors of mugs, and everyone knows which is theirs, and they reuse it, and then they wash it when they're there for any event, whether it's a meeting during the week or whether it's social hour after worship service on the weekend. Policies around purchasing. Is the paper being used in the office coming from a source that has a high recycled content? Are the cleansers being used in cleaning the bathrooms and cleaning the other spaces in the house of worship non-toxic? Do soaps have antibacterial agents in them? That's not good for the groundwater. It contributes to the loss of the ability to use antibiotics to treat diseases because we get antibiotic resistant microbes. So having just normal soap that doesn't have all those extra chemicals in it is actually a good thing. These are very small changes. They don't cost much, but they make a big difference in terms of sustainability and how we affect the world around us. And as I mentioned before, most congregations have switched to fair trade coffee. Now, I mentioned that there were congregations that had figured out that what you do in the kitchen matters. And one example of this comes from the Madison Christian community in Madison, Wisconsin. This is a congregation that some years ago, back in 2000, there was a new minister, the Reverend Jeff Wild. And one day as he got out of his car at the church, it occurred to him that it was very windy, and this church would be a great place to put in a wind turbine so that they could generate renewable energy and not contribute to climate change. So he did what churches do. He organized a task force. And their research proved that if they actually put in a wind turbine big enough to pay for itself by generating enough energy, it would be on a scale that did not belong in a residential neighborhood. But in the process of researching the wind turbine, they discovered that they had one south-facing roof that was perfect for solar panels. And so they were able to get a grant that helped to pay for putting in solar panels. But they also discovered while they were doing this research that there was a lot that they could do to improve the way they used electricity so that the energy from those solar panels would cover a larger percentage of the energy that they needed to run this congregation. One of the things they discovered is that if they ran the dishwasher in their kitchen, which was a commercial dishwasher that used a lot of energy, if they did that at the same time that the lights were on in the sanctuary, that they were creating a peak in energy use that meant that they were paying a higher rate for their electricity. And this led them to understand about how energy use isn't just about how much you use, but it's also about when you use it and whether you use a whole lot at one time or you level out the amount of energy you use. What happens in our country is that our power plants are designed to provide enough energy for the coldest days in the winter and the warmest days in the summer, the moments when we use a whole lot of energy. That actually means that we create power plants that produce more energy than we need most of the time. So if we can actually lower our energy use to stabilize it so that we use a more even amount throughout the day and throughout the year, we're actually reducing the need for extra power plants. And that's particularly important for climate change because a lot of the peak energy that we use comes from turning on the dirtiest power plants, the old coal burning power plants, so they can feed into the grid the extra energy we need during those high peak moments. So the Madison Christian community, they passed a simple policy. They said, okay, we should not run the dishwasher while the lights are on in the sanctuary. And you can see in the background of this picture in the kitchen, over the hood of the stove, there is a sign that basically says, don't run the dishwasher until the lights are off in the sanctuary. It's just a simple reminder that they should only run one or the other of these high electrical demand systems at once. Now, the other reason it's important to shave the peaks is it makes it easier for us to generate our energy with renewable resources, which are not as good at supplying those high peak levels of energy. So if we can better distribute our energy use by thinking about when we run our appliances and by insulating our buildings and using low energy appliances so that we use a smaller amount and the amount we use stays in the building instead of getting dispersed quickly, we make a big difference in terms of our capacity for energy efficiency. So even a behavior change, like just changing when you use certain amounts of electricity, can make a big difference. It also reduced the amount they paid for energy because, as you can see from this chart from New England, the energy companies try to motivate us not to use energy when it's at its highest peak by pricing it at a higher level during those times. Shifting away from energy, there are many other ways that congregations are taking care of creation. And building and grounds offer places where people can think about how to care for the environment around them in ways that aren't just about the humans, but also about the other beings with whom we share the space. Here at the Madison Christian Community, they have a somewhat unusual setup in that they're actually on 6 acres of land. And this land is considered by them to have been a gift from God. This community, which is an ecumenical community, a space that is shared by both a United Church of Christ congregation and an evangelical Lutheran congregation, this land was given to them in 1970 when they were just forming and wanted to find a space where they could have a church that these two communities would share. The land had been a farm, and the farmers who sold the land to developers had said they wanted 6 acres of the land to be set aside for a church so that the new neighborhood that would be built on that former farmland would actually include a place of worship. And that land was then offered to this newly formed Madison Christian Community. So they took that as a sign that it was a gift from God, and therefore they had an obligation to care for this land and to be stewards of creation on this piece of property. Now, Madison is the homeland of Aldo Leopold, one of the great founders of the field of ecology, who was famous for doing landscape restoration. He himself bought up an old farm and worked to restore native plants on it. And when he worked at the University of the University of Wisconsin, he did a lot of research on how to restore natural habitats on land that had been degraded by farming. So it was natural here at the Madison Christian Community to think about doing a restored prairie on part of their land. And in fact, they have 2 separate prairie areas. This one that you see here is known as the Bluebird Prairie. It's on the side of the church, which, as you can see in the background, ends at a residential neighborhood. Now, if you're going to do prairie restoration, one of the things that is necessary for the health and maintenance of native prairie plants is to periodically burn the land. Our native prairie plants are fire-adapted species. They thrive after periodic burning. And it also means that invasive species, which are not fire-adapted, are more easily kept under control. You have to have very good relations with your neighbors if you're going to burn the property next to their homes periodically. So when it's time to do a prairie burn, they go out and they put hangers on the doors of all the neighbors to warn them that the date is coming up. And then they very carefully do fire management. And the end result is that they have this glorious landscape that is a habitat for all kinds of birds and insects and some wildlife, even though it's in the middle of a residential neighborhood. At the time when I was visiting this congregation, I had a chat with the UCC minister, Tisha Brown, who told me that when she first arrived there, she looked out and they had just done a prairie burn. And from her office, she could see this burned landscape and she thought it was just the ugliest thing she'd ever seen. But then it started to green up and new life was emerging. And she said she couldn't help herself. She just started writing blog articles about resurrection based on the prairie. Because of the prairie, there's a strong environmental ethic here at the Madison Christian community. It goes all the way back to their founding in 1970. So they're always looking for new ways that they can implement activities to care for creation. And one of the projects that they came up with a few years ago was to actually collect the rainwater off their roof. Pastor Wild wrote a grant application and was able to purchase a large water holding tank through that. And now they channel the water from the roof into this big holding tank, which they use to water the plants in their community gardens. Now, this water collection process has multiple benefits. One, of course, they're using water that isn't chlorinated on the gardens, and that does seem to be good for the plants. But it also helps with climate adaptation, because one of the effects of climate change is that we're seeing heavier precipitation events. And any way that we can help to manage the storm water that gathers on our grounds helps our sewer systems, our stormwater systems, and the environment. Whenever we get runoff from stormwater, it can carry pollutants from pavement and from roads down into our water systems. And a lot of those pollutants are chemicals that are not filtered out by our water systems before the water drains into the nearest wetland or river. So the more we can slow that water down and have it flow through soil where nature's natural processes filter out contaminants, the better it is for the ecosystems. And it also has the benefit of not overwhelming the stormwater system and creating backups and issues in people's basements or in other public areas. So here you see, even at the sidewalk, with the curb lawn between the sidewalk and the street, the Madison Christian community has been putting in rain gardens to capture stormwater runoff and help prevent contamination. The idea of doing rain gardens has caught on at many houses of worship. Here you see an example from Toledo, Ohio, where a church has actually put in a rain garden to help handle the water that comes off the roof of the church. This has additional benefits of protecting the basement from dampness, and they know they're doing something good in helping to manage stormwater that's going to get stronger and stronger as climate change continues. There are also ways to add extra benefits, so you get a win-win out of a rain garden. You can plant native plants that don't mind having their feet wet in these rain gardens. And a good side effect of that is you can be creating habitat for pollinators like birds and bees and butterflies and beetles, all of which are tremendously stressed because we no longer have hedgerows and undeveloped areas where they can live and thrive. Many of us are aware of the problems, particularly of the monarch butterfly, which has become the poster child for the struggles of the pollinators in our world. In Detroit, they've got a great program called Rain Gardens to the Rescue. The Sierra Club helps to sponsor this, as well as a local organization called Friends of the Rouge. The Rouge is a river, and it, of course, can be contaminated by the stormwater runoff. This is even worse in places like Detroit, where the sewer systems and stormwater systems are linked. So if you have heavy rain, it may actually cause an overflow of sewage. In Kalamazoo, we're lucky we don't have that problem. But the last thing you want is sewage flowing into your rivers and streams, or just even into your community areas because there's a backup in the system. So rain gardens are a way to help with that. And we see here homes putting in rain gardens in Ann Arbor and in Detroit as a way to help prevent stormwater issues and also plant native plants and provide habitat for the wonderful pollinators with whom we share creation. Returning to the Madison Christian community, since they have 6 acres of land, 2 acres is prairie, but another couple acres are actually used as community gardens. And these gardens actually connect to a number of different ministries in the church. Every spring, a group of men from a local prison comes here on a work furlough. And they come here to help set up the gardens for the spring, because this is hard work. And a lot of the gardeners from the church community are a little older and not necessarily up to the heavier labor. So this becomes part of a restorative justice program in which these men have a chance to come and be part of the wider community, which feeds them lunch and works alongside of them and expresses its appreciation for them and their contributions to this community. Another part of this program is that the men are actually in a prison that has a horticultural training program. It's one of the work training programs that's run in this particular prison, trying to provide the men who are incarcerated with skills that they can then use when they get out so that they can find employment and not end up back in jail. That horticultural program produces heirloom plants, which are then purchased by organizations like the Madison Christian Community as starter plants for their gardens. So this is a restorative justice program on multiple levels, both through the direct engagement with the men and also by supporting the educational program being run in the prison so that these men will be better able to stay out of jail in the future. I had a chance actually to participate in the day when the men were here on work furlough setting up the garden and to have lunch with them. And it was clear that it meant a tremendous amount to these men to be sitting down and eating with people and feeling appreciated for what they could contribute to this community. It was an emotional and psychologically affirming day to know that they weren't being seen as bad people. They were being seen as people of value in this community. The garden also becomes a way to engage with the wider community. People in the neighborhood come here to walk, and they also come here to visit the chickens. Children love chickens. And anyone from the community who comes to visit the chickens is liable to encounter one of the ministers who will offer them the opportunity to sign up to help with chicken care, a project that is not limited to people who belong to the church itself. So the gardens become a way to engage with the wider community. And in fact, there are certain areas of the garden that are set aside as subscription gardens where community members can actually pay a minimal fee of $35 or $40 and have a plot of land where they can grow their own fruits or vegetables or flowers in the community garden on the church grounds. So this becomes a way for the church to work within for its own members to have gardening space, but also then to work with the wider community so that people who would benefit from having the opportunity to grow fresh produce in the garden would have that opportunity. And this project has actually then led to a larger program. They actually have a children's garden as well as a food pantry garden. The food pantry garden is exactly what it sounds like. A number of the church members grow food, which they then donate to a food pantry so that people in poverty will have access to fresh produce throughout the summer. The children's garden is a special project. In the children's garden, members of the church work with children from a local community center. Now, this community center is about a mile away, but just by traveling that mile, you're traveling from a middle-class neighborhood where the Madison Christian Community is located to a low-income neighborhood. So in this program, children from the community center at the Lucier Neighborhood Center come over to the church on Tuesdays and Thursdays throughout the summer. And they're divided into two groups. One group works out in the garden and they get to learn about how to take care of the plants. And meanwhile, another group is in the kitchen learning how to make things with the produce that comes from the garden. The children who participate in this program enjoy weeding, they enjoy eating the berries, they enjoy learning about the plants, but along the way, they're also learning about responsibility. One of the stories I was told was about a little girl named Ruthie. She was about 10 years old, and one day she said, "You know, you can't lie to the earth. I might tell you I watered the plants, but they'll tell you whether I really did or not." And so you have stories like this that demonstrate that the children are actually gaining lessons about life and responsibility. This is a secular program, since they're working with a community center, not just with their own um, Sunday school kids, but they're still trying to teach values to these children. And the kids who are working in the kitchen, they are so proud when they bring out the snacks or the meals that they prepared and they serve them to the group that's been working outside in the garden. One of the additional elements of this program is that all of these children get to take home a bag of food to their families every week. This is, of course, particularly important during the summer when children are not attending school, where they have access to school food programs. These kids are proud that they are contributing to their families. And it's not charity because they have sweat equity. They grew that food themselves and they took it home and shared it with their families. One little boy was asked if he'd made something special with the broccoli that he's taken home one week. And he said, well, actually, he was saving it. He wanted it to be for a special occasion because it was such a beautiful broccoli that he had grown in the garden. So it's striking that back in 2008, when we had the Great Recession, there were sociologists who commented that it was the first time we'd had a recession in the United States where the majority of people in the country actually didn't know how to prepare food from scratch and therefore couldn't use scratch cooking as a way to save money in a time when their budgets were tight. These children will never have that problem. They know how to prepare food from scratch. What becomes evident when you look at a community like the Madison Christian community is that care for the earth here is not just one project. It's not just something a small group within the community does. It is something that has become part of their mission, part of their identity. And one of the things that Reverend Wild said is that to him, this was essentially a ministry of place, that the grounds and the building had actually become a place of religious practice. And he felt that as people were outside planting and growing things, they were digging and growing plants and cultivating the roots of the plants, but they were also cultivating their roots as members of the community. They were connecting to each other, building a stronger community, both within the congregation and between the congregation and the neighborhood around it. One of the wonderful examples of how this community makes stewardship of creation part of everything they do came up in relation to a bur oak tree that used to stand in front of the church and shade the walkway that people would walk along as they entered the front door. The tree had been dropping a number of branches, so they consulted an arborist, and he told them the tree was unhealthy and would need to be taken out before it became dangerous. So naturally, they consulted two more arborists because they really didn't want to cut down this beautiful tree. But everybody concurred the tree was unhealthy and it needed to be removed. Rather than wait until summer when no one was looking and take out the tree and have the larger community return in the fall to find a naked space, they took their time. They waited a year before taking that tree out. And during that year, they made that tree part of everything they did in the community. So that year's fundraising campaign had tree themes about building the strength of the community by donating to strengthen the roots and the trunk of the community. But more than that, they did things to bring the tree into the worship practices and the education practices of the community. A professional storyteller worked with members of the congregation to help them take their favorite tree story and turn it into a story that they could share with people. In Sunday school classes, the children read passages of the Bible that talked about trees and time that people had spent near trees. And then they all went out and they gathered up the acorns under this old Baroque tree. And in Sunday school class, they ground up those acorns and they turned them into flour. Members of the community then took that flour home and baked it into bread that they brought back and used for communion on one of the Sunday services. So the tree became part of the people. The people celebrated the tree in their worship service. So this is a remarkable example of how the education program, the worship program, and the grounds can all come together and be integrated so that stewardship of creation isn't just something happening with one small group of people off to the side. It's something that becomes part of the religious tradition for everybody within the community. Community gardens are actually a lot of work. This is not a project to be entered into lightly if people decide to do gardens. It is, however, something that's very popular within faith communities. In Detroit, the Muslim community has established an urban community garden. And here, their idea is that this garden is a place where anybody can come and take the produce. So rather than them doing distribution of the produce is simply open to community members to come and take advantage of. And the garden then becomes a means of doing community outreach and engagement. This is also a congregation that has worked with Michigan Interfaith Power and Light to do energy efficiency worship. So the community garden is an exterior activity, and then inside the building, they're also doing energy efficiency work. Congregations like this, congregations like the Madison Christian Community, they actually attract new members because people who are passing these houses of worship, when they see the community gardens or when they see solar panels, they stop to check that place out. That's the kind of congregation that draws members. One of the things that was so striking to me as I've traveled around the country and visited congregations is that congregations that engage in stewardship of creation seem to have very stable memberships. And they also seem to have more young families. They seem to be defying the national trend toward the reduction of membership in houses of worship, which nationally is happening across all religions and all denominations. Another way to do gardening is to let other people use your land if you have space. Or if you grow produce, maybe you don't need to set up your own food pantry or distribution system. You can work with systems that already exist out there. At the First Universalist Church of Rockland in Maine, back in 2005, they heard about a young couple that wanted to start a community-supported agriculture farm. This was actually going to be the first CSA in Maine. At this point in time, there weren't any yet in the state. So they decided that they would work with the farm. Now, the way a CSA works is that a bunch of shareholders pay beforehand for the produce that they will receive during the growing season. So they put up their money at a time when the farmer needs that money in order to buy the supplies, to buy a tractor, to buy fuel, to lease land, to buy seeds, and maybe to set up a hoop house or some greenhouse space to start the seeds. And the farmer then uses that money in order to set the growing process in motion. And then as the produce comes ready throughout the year, the shareholders each receive a weekly portion. The shareholders essentially have become supporters, stakeholders, if you will, investors in the farm. And if it's a good year, they'll get a lot out of their investment. And if it's a bad year because of an insect infestation or bad weather, they may not get as much for their money. But in this way, they're sharing the risk, and they're, in this case, helping young farmers to get started, which really isn't easy to do if you don't have an influx of money. So this idea was raised at the congregation, and they thought, well, okay, we'll give it a try. And that first year, there were 15 shareholders, which isn't a lot, but it was enough to get it started. And people would then receive their box of goods throughout the summer at the church. The church became the CSA drop-off stuff. So then other church members would see the beautiful produce that people were receiving. And so the next year, there were 42 people enrolled as shareholders. And the following year, there were 70 people. And the next year there were 120 people. And then finally the farmers had to put a cap and say, okay, 200 is the limit because we can't get any more space. We can only provide food for 200 people. So this was such a successful program that this young couple made enough money, they were able to buy the land that they had started out leasing. They also developed such a wonderful connection with the people in the congregation that they joined the church. And one of the things that motivated them to join the church was that at a certain point, they weren't just growing food on the farm, they were growing children, and they wanted a place where their children could interact with the kind of community that they had come to know through their interactions at the CSA. Another example of a garden project is the New Eden Garden out in Newbury, Massachusetts. This congregation had shrunk down to where there were only about 45 members. And they decided that the emphasis of their congregation would be to be stewards of spirit and earth, which was a great idea, but then they had to figure out what did it mean to be stewards of spirit and earth. And one of the ideas that came up was that they should develop a community garden on the large space that they had behind the church. So they started the New Eden Gardens. They prepared some beds, they started a garden, and then summer happened and people were busy and very few people were attending the church and pretty much everything died. So they had to go back and start over. They realized they needed a volunteer coordinator who would take charge of the program. They also realized they needed to know a whole lot more about gardening. The soil was rocky. They weren't sure how to make things grow in it. And so they formed a partnership with a gardening cooperative in the area, and they started offering classes for people who were subscribers who had decided they wanted to claim a garden bed and grow produce. And so that meant that there were experts on hand who could teach people about composting and teach people about how to enrich the soil and teach people about how to manage insects in a way that didn't require the use of chemicals. And finally, this project took off. And part of why it took off was because that collaboration with the garden cooperative meant that more community members now knew about the garden. And so it wasn't just church members who were using the land. There were people from the wider community who were coming and asking to have a chance to lease one of the garden plots and grow things there. So this, again, became a way that the congregation was connecting to the wider community, and the garden grew and thrived. People who started these projects, one of the things that they said they learned is that, first of all, you had to be willing to try something and not have it work, and then figure out what to do to make it work better the next time. And also, particularly with the CSA, they said they recognized it was okay if something started small. If it was a good project, it would grow. So this was one of the lessons they shared with me. Things may start small, but they will grow if you find the right project. So thinking back over some of the activities we've seen in relation to land, water, and food, managing stormwater is going to be a bigger and bigger issue because of climate change. So figuring out how to capture water and filter it, how to have it go down into the groundwater table instead of into the storm sewer system, this is actually a very important thing that we can all work on. And rain gardens are a beautiful way to do that, because while we're managing the storm water, we can also be creating a beautiful garden with flowers and protecting our basements from water, protecting our wetlands from contamination, and putting in habitat for pollinators. Rain barrels are also useful for capturing water that you can use to water your gardens. Thinking about ways that the lands in our houses of worship can support biodiversity while reducing pollution. Having native plant gardens, which means less grass and more garden. That means less mowing, less use of chemicals to protect the grass from evil things like dandelions, which I think are kind of pretty. And if you can create wildlife habitat while you're at it, then you're providing space for pollinators, for birds, for other animals with whom we share this creation. Community gardens, they're wonderful because they provide fresh, local, organic, seasonal, and sustainable food. They're also a way to grow community. But it really helps if you have partnerships that can help turn these projects into a success. They take a big time commitment. Partnering with food pantries. I've seen a number of cases where a synagogue and some churches will get together, and maybe one of those houses of worship actually has a food distribution program, and the others then provide their produce to that one program, so they don't all have to create a distribution network. Or working with a secular local food pantry can be very helpful. You grow stuff and take it to them, or they even may come and pick it up, and then they'll handle the distribution and make sure it gets to the people who need it. And connecting with community programs for help with gardening, to set up the garden, to maintain the garden, to learn how to do it, or educational programs. There are many programs that are available to help with setting up stormwater systems based on rain gardens or rain barrels. Wildlife habitat, there are programs that will help with native plant gardens. So there are a lot of resources out there that can help you do these things. Now, as a final example of activities, I wanted to turn to advocacy, because we're in the middle of a political season, and advocacy is something that is important, but also a little tricky to do, because as nonprofits, we are not supposed to take a stand and get involved in some kinds of political campaigns. It's also true that many congregations are unwilling to get involved in issues that may seem political, like climate change, when they're worried that some community members may actually be upset or perceive this as taking sides. And one of the ways to avoid that problem is to work with parachurch organizations. So there are many organizations like Michigan Interfaith Power and Light that will actually offer information on how faith might affect voting. And they don't do it in a partisan way. They simply provide resources to talk about how stewardship of creation is something that people of faith ought to think about, because it does connect to our spiritual values. Those resources can be distributed, or people can be pointed towards the website without actually having a congregation or a congregation leader say, we say you have to vote for this person, or we say you have to vote for that person. There are other organizations that bring up diverse projects, as there might be a proposal on the ballot to change a state's renewable energy standard, or there might be a national project to protest against a change to the Endangered Species Act. Some years ago, there was an Operation Noah's Ark, in which Catholics and evangelicals were working together to protect the Endangered Species Act from some changes that would reduce its efficacy. And again, these are probably issues that a congregation doesn't necessarily take a stand on, but it is possible to share the word, to do an educational event and say, here's an issue. And if members would like to sign on to a petition, or if members would like to know about the website of this organization where they can go and find more information, that's always an option. So connecting with parachurch organizations is a very good way to engage in advocacy, to find out what's going on at the local level, at the state level, at the national level that affects our stewardship of creation. And to make it possible for individual members of a congregation to engage in advocacy work that relates to proposals or policies that are in development, but to do it in a way that is not going to cause tension within the faith community. So just to reiterate, I've only touched on a few of the ways that people can care for creation. Hopefully these stories and these examples give you some ideas of things that you can do in your congregation. The Michigan Interfaith Power and Light website has a link to a Stewards of Hope program that actually has lists for every one of these areas: building and grounds, water, land, advocacy, values and culture. And so there's some thought starter lists there of projects that can be done. They also have links to resources for greening synagogues or greening churches. There are many manuals that have been put out by different organizations, like the Presbyterian Church with their Earth Care Congregation Manual. There's a wonderful website called Web of Creation that's developed by Lutherans. And so a lot of those, you can find links to them on the Michigan Interfaith Power and Light website. Michigan IPL also has some programs that they've developed with Michigan utilities that are specifically aimed at helping congregations care for creation. So the Light the Way program is a partnership with utilities to go in and do energy audits and provide some resource upgrades like LED lights and LED exit signs to congregations. And it is a free program because it's paid for under a state program for encouraging energy efficiency. The House of Worship Rewards program is a project in which houses of worship can organize an educational event to encourage members of the congregation to do home energy audits. So there you see the idea of doing the energy efficiency work in the house of worship, spreading outward into the community so that members can actually practice this within their homes. And then we have the ripple effects that what we do in our congregation should also be done in our personal lives. So that's one really useful reference that we have here in Michigan with sources that congregations can use. And one thing I'd like to leave you with, as they said at the First Universalist congregation in Rockland, Maine, things may start small, but they will grow. There were projects they started that worked. There were projects they started that had short lifespans. The ones that worked were the ones that really fit their congregation. They fit the location, they fit the wider community. They allowed people to use their interests, and they were projects that seemed to have the most effect on the community around them. So try things. Don't be too concerned if something you try doesn't work. Try something else. It's all a matter of finding the project that fits your congregation and fits your community context. The stories I've told are thought starters. What you do with them will probably be different because we all live in different ecosystems, in different communities with a different range of resources and with different needs. I hope you'll find some of these resources helpful, some of these ideas helpful as you think about what it means to be a steward of creation and what sort of activities your green team can engage in. In the future, here at Hope for Creation, we would like to develop some events where we can use Zoom to actually have a community conversation and bring in people who have had experience doing some of the more complicated projects, like installing solar panels on a house of worship, so that there can be a presentation followed by some discussion so that we can learn from each other. And if we know each other's, what the challenges were and how they were overcome, it makes it easier for others to engage in similar activities. I hope you'll come back and join us for some of those future events. Thank you.